We're excited to have our speaker, Heather Hurlburt, with us. Before we get started, I want to just thank our corporate sponsor, our main corporate sponsor, Wells Fargo Private Bank, and our education sponsors, Jim and Diane Cameron. Also, the Pikes Peak Library District for doing the videotaping that they do with us. And let me introduce Sky Forrester, who is going to introduce our speaker for the night.
And I just want to add my thanks for coming out in this wonderful weather. It was 70 degrees just a few days ago. For coming out tonight in this snow and blustery weather, you have a real treat. Heather Hurlburt and I worked together in a very ugly place called Vienna, Austria, some years ago, in another century, and doing conventional arms control. She was working for Capitol Hill as an observer to the then Conference on Security and Cooperation in Europe, now the Organization on Security and Cooperation in Europe. A young woman who was clearly going places and going to have an impact, and she has. She's done a lot of things since we last crossed paths in Vienna. She was a speechwriter for the Clinton administration, for Madeleine Albright, and for President Clinton. She was Washington director, deputy director of the International Crisis Group. She was a member of the State Department Policy Planning Staff, program director at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. 4 years, as I said, as a member of the U.S. delegation of the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. She co-hosts Blogging Heads TV show with Dan Dresner called Dresbert, and is a regular commentator on politics and policy in a variety of medium. She now is at the New America Foundation, director of the New Models of Policy Change program. She's also a senior fellow at Human Rights First. She has co-authored U.S. in the World, Talking Global Issues with Americans, which sounds like ought to be a byline for the World Affairs Councils. Published by the Rockefeller Brothers Fund and the Aspen Institute in 2004. She's a graduate of Brown University and George Washington University, and she made it here from Washington before the snow flew. And we're very grateful to have her here. Heather Hurlburt, it's a pleasure to welcome you to our podium.
Well, first of all, I just want to point out that Sky and I were obviously breaking a number of child labor laws when we worked together in Vienna at the end of the Cold War in the early 1990s. I also confessed to Sky beforehand that the last time I came to Colorado to speak at a World Affairs Council, that time in Denver, there was also an unexpected blizzard. So I'm 0 for 2. Right, yeah. Now, the other thing that I confessed to him earlier that I'm just going to warn you now is that time the power also went out in the hotel. So white lights lead to red lights, which mark the exit. In some cases, the nearest exit may be behind you. If you had told me all those years ago that, let's see, number one, that Sky would turn out to be a person of such great distinction, number two, that he would have enough money at his disposal to fly me out here from Washington. Number three, that half of those jobs he just read off on my resume even existed, I would have been quite stunned. So I think we're a funny example of how much globalization and technology have changed the way we do national security and foreign policy in the last couple of decades. And we're also an example, something which the older folks in the room know, and the younger folks in the room will soon find out that, man, you just never know who is going to follow you through life. You just never know who is going to show up again 25 years later saying, are you the same Heather Hurlburt? So with a special thanks to friendship, and I say that for Sky personally, but also World Affairs Councils, which I have enormously enjoyed going around the country and talking to over the years. I think I'm almost into double digits. And I do have to say this is a great turnout for this weather, so thank you all very much. It's very flattering to me, but the relatively small turnout means that we're going to have lots of audience participation. So I do not believe in hour-long lectures. I do not give hour-long lectures. One of the most depressing things about being a speechwriter was that you learned how excruciatingly boring canned speeches are. And there's nothing worse than somebody looking down at a text and reading. So anyway, I'm going to talk for 15 or 20 minutes, and then the rest of the time we're going to argue amongst ourselves. So just get ready as we go. So the topic that Sky gave me was where is the public on national security issues? And I thought, since we've just come through an election that got a little bit of attention, I thought I'd start by sort of going through what we know about where the public is, and then looking at the big issues we're going to face in the next 6 months through the prism of, if you're a decision maker, if you're a member of Congress, and you're trying to both do the right thing, whatever you think that is, and do what's acceptable to your constituents, what on earth are you doing right now? So it's kind of a different way of doing it around the world from a Washington perspective, and then, as I say, we can argue like crazy in the Q&A. So if I were going to use just a couple of adjectives to describe where the American public is on national security issues right now, I'd say anxious, I'd say unsettled. I wouldn't say afraid in the way that those of us who grew up during the Cold War remember, or even in the period immediately after 9/11. I'd say distrustful of their own government and other governments and their own institutions. And I'd also say polarized. So we'll talk a little bit about what each of those things mean. Walmart, in its infinite wisdom, has decided that it wants to brand a segment of the electorate as Walmart moms. And so Walmart has commissioned a series of bipartisan focus groups done by a Republican and Democratic pollster together, looking at women with kids of a certain age group. And the fascinating thing about these focus groups is that the women continually express a lot of anxiety. And a lot of anxiety that, frankly, I'm not going to say anything about Colorado Springs, but maybe those of us inside the Beltway don't always really understand why so much anxiety. Or maybe we have the habit of saying, yeah, that's all about the economy, and national security is completely separate from that, doesn't have anything to do with it. Well, September this year, the pollsters did their focus groups, found a lot of anxiety, all of it focused on ISIS. Now, you might think if you're a mom in Louisiana or Arkansas or North Carolina, you have a lot of things to worry about, but getting your head cut off is not really so much one of them. But nonetheless, these women were very, very anxious about ISIS and its potential to affect them. Come back a month later to do these same focus groups, same group of women, still showing very similar levels of anxiety. But what were they anxious about? Can anybody guess? Yeah, pretty much completely, almost no anxiety reported about ISIS, tons of anxiety reported about Ebola. So what that tells you is something that you probably know just through your own life, your own interactions with your neighbors. We're living in an anxious time, and that free-floating anxiety can very easily fasten on to national security issues, which as professionals can make our jobs harder, and as politicians provides an almost unbearably tempting target. Let's mobilize people using fear. Let's tap into that anxiety. And sometimes from a national security policy perspective, that works really well. Other times it works out pretty badly, and we'll talk about that a little bit as we go forward. But just that anxiety, and the rat part of our brain, at the back does not distinguish between I'm anxious about whether my kid can pay off his college loans and I'm anxious that my husband who works at the hospital might catch Ebola. It's all going back to the rat brain together. So that's something that is really profoundly affecting how we make national security policy now, but we don't tend to think about it because, we all get this fabulous education to think about our issues. And if only the public understood about ISIS, they would support us doing X, whatever X is. But that is not actually the way public opinion works. So second, the public is unsettled. And so you see these really fascinating, totally contradictory poll results. So one of my favorites is that fewer than half of Americans think that sending ground troops to fight ISIS would work, but 3/4 think that we'll end up doing it anyway. So some people look at that and say, oh, the public is stupid. Now, I actually don't believe that, because I think if you polled experts, if you polled military campaign strategists, if you polled Syria and Iraq experts, how many of them think that a ground intervention would work? You'd get a pretty small number. How many of them think it might happen anyway? You'd get a somewhat larger number. So actually, a lot of times when the public seems to be being contradictory or stupid, the funny thing is, if you talk to the experts, you hear the same kinds of messages, just dressed up a lot more elegantly, because we all learned how to do that. The other thing, whenever you look at public opinion numbers on your own, and if you see results that seem contradictory, the way the pollsters, professionals, explain that is the public views are unsettled, that the public doesn't yet know what it thinks. And that's the moment that's most interesting and fruitful for us educators and policy professionals, because it means we've still got a chance to educate. Minds are still open, and we can teach something. On the downside, as I say, it's also the moment where fear-mongering or disinformation or some crazy idea that someone has is also maximally likely to be effective. I mentioned that the public is distrustful, and we're all used to the idea the public doesn't trust the media anymore, the public doesn't trust teachers anymore, the public certainly doesn't trust federal government anymore, doesn't trust state government all that much. And you're really starting to see this trickle into national security policy. So, again, this, oh, well, the government will do X, the military will do Y, but it won't work, but they should do it anyway, which, especially on Veterans Day, for a country that has had such an awe of our military for so long, is a very strange thing to see. And again, at the same time, the military is one of the most respected institutions in American life still. And at the same time, the public looks and says, yeah, we don't think they can fix that. So then you either say, oh, the public is being stupid, or actually, maybe the public's being pretty smart. But this distrust, you see it with Ebola, and that's a real problem, because if the public doesn't trust public health authorities, it doesn't matter who's making the rules, you cannot control epidemics. So we, in national security, have kind of dodged this problem and even maybe chuckled or thought, that our friends in the media just got what was coming to them, or our friends in the academy, with apologies to the many here who teach at universities, that, yeah, it's good that people are a little more suspicious of academia, but now, guess what? People are just as suspicious of the national security establishment. So lastly, I mentioned the public is polarized, and this is fascinating because there are some issues where partisanship is everything in national security, and others where it's not. So it's sort of instructive to go through and look at those, and since, as I mentioned, we just had a sort of interesting election, particularly for you all here in Colorado, I thought I'd talk a little bit about what you could learn by looking at exit polls. And now, normal people, the day after the election, got up and said, oh, thank goodness, I don't have to think about this anymore. And then for the rest of us, there were the exit polls to read. So I read the exit polls, so you didn't have to. You're welcome. So it's still the case that, as my old boss used to say, it's the economy stupid. And just the economy, more than 2 to 1, when you ask voters what their biggest issue was, on what basis they were voting, it was the economy. But the interesting, so 44% of people who actually voted said the economy was their top issue. Just 13% said foreign policy, national security. But what's interesting about that is that foreign policy, national security was number 3, behind economy and partisan gridlock, ahead of immigration and healthcare. And when you think of how we spent the last couple of years hearing about either how immigration or healthcare was going to be the big issue that would decide the midterms, and then they both fell below national security and saliency, that tells you something about the public, and that the public, in fact, was paying attention. So, ISIS. People who actually voted in the midterms pretty strongly support taking military action against ISIS. That's uniform across both parties. That's not polarized. But interestingly, would you like to guess which party had a higher rate of disapproval of military action taken against ISIS? Republican Party, 15% higher disapproval of taking military action against ISIS. And of course, what I want to know is that disapproving it because a Democratic president is doing it, or disapproving it from the sort of newly neo-isolationist wing of the party? And the exit pollsters didn't care about that, so I can't tell you, but it's a fascinating little fact. So another one, terrorism. Almost 3/4 of voters are worried that there'll be another major terrorist attack in the US. So 3/4 of voters, clearly you've got strong bipartisan majority there. Terrorism is something that worries members of both parties. But Republicans are twice as likely to say it as Democrats. So your terrorism voters are twice as likely to be Republicans. And if you're a political leader and you're trying to think about how much you talk about terrorism, how you talk about terrorism, how you place it in your list of things, thinking about who your core voters are is going to press very strongly on your decision making. And that is an interesting challenge if you're trying to make good policy on the merits. Don't care which party you come from, don't care what you actually think about terrorism, but that kind of polarization is going to split what you choose to say and how you choose to say it. Again, I'll just mention Ebola. So again, this kind of suspicion, disapprove beats approve by 10 points, but that's completely partisan. If you're a Democrat, you basically think the government's doing an okay job on Ebola. If you're a Republican, you basically think not. And the interesting thing about that is I know lots of Democrats who know a lot about public health and will just savage some of the things the CDC did. And I know some Republicans who think, yeah, Ebola's not coming anywhere near where I am. Everything's basically fine. So what does that tell you? That there's a whole bunch of issues, and some of them as important as public health, where when people don't really know, aren't really sure, on national security issues, on our issues, they're falling back on their partisan frame to make decisions. And that, we've always had some of that in this country, but during the Cold War, we had a basically agreed frame, and we fought, in retrospect, we fought around the margins of the frame. After 9/11, we had a basically agreed frame, and in retrospect, we were fighting around the margins. And right now, the public does not have a frame for what the US is doing in the world, why is it doing it, how is it doing it, how is it going to affect us. And so what many, many Americans, not the people in this room, of course, who follow foreign affairs very carefully and judge every individual issue on its own merits, I'm sure, but what a lot of our fellow Americans who aren't passionate about these issues are doing is falling back on partisan, partisan attachments. But of course, what's crazy about that is never in my lifetime have the two parties been so divided internally on national security issues. And, in Washington, frankly, the most fascinating thing to watch as a national security perspective is the debate within the Republican Party on national security. It's like a PhD seminar. You get Marco Rubio versus Rand Paul. It's like a political science seminar. It's fantastic. The Democrats, and as you can tell from my resume, I'm a Democrat. I don't want to pretend otherwise. But the Democrats can't put up anything to match it in terms of sort of the range and depth of really ideological, in the intellectual sense of that word, discussion and debate. Of course, it helps when your president's in office, you keep your mouth a little bit shut about your disagreements. But both parties, back to those words I used at the beginning, anxious, confused, distrustful, that describes the atmosphere within both political parties on national security, which means that we're going to see this really strange, anxious time of our political leaders constantly looking over their shoulders and saying, okay, number one, what do I actually think is right and on the merits? Number two, what's going to get me in trouble with my voters? And number three, what's going to get me in trouble with which part of the party leadership that I need to be aligning myself with in order to do whatever I want to do in the party? Now, I have a little tiny bit of idealism left, despite having known Sky all this time. And I have to say most of the elected officials of both parties that I've had the privilege of knowing do genuinely want to do the right thing. But if sort of doing the right thing on the merits is only one of 3 challenges that you're facing, and you're really not sure what the right thing is anyway because your expertise is in healthcare or poverty reduction or banking, then you are awfully likely to take in your ideas about how to do national security through ideological sources. And that's one of the things that's making the debate on our issues quite different from what it was 5 or 10 years ago. That, for example, I had a job where a large part of what I did was take retired flag officers around to talk to members of Congress. And at the beginning, when we started doing this, this had this fantastic effect that the members of Congress were awed by these folks and were very receptive to what they had to say. And since in general they tended to be pretty pragmatic, non-ideological, Senator, I want you to do this because it works. Congressman, I want you to understand that this doesn't work. It was great. At a certain point, there's been this kind of diminishing trend where nobody wants to talk to an expert unless they're ideologically vetted. So if the Heritage Foundation on the right or the Center for American Progress on the left says, this is our military expert, then there's a group of people who are going to say, okay, that's the one we're going to listen to. Now, the really bad news, frankly, is not that that's happening, but the days that someone says, well, we're not even going to get an expert, we're just going to look at whatever, think tank on our side of the issue says. And, if an expert said it, okay. If a 22-year-old sort of wrote some talking points on it, that's okay too. But again, it's happening because folks aren't coming in with any kind of independent grounding, and the public's not giving back a sort of an independent grounding on what it wants. So how's this going to play out in some actual issues? And if I don't mention your issue again, like I said, we'll talk about it and argue about it in the Q&A. So one of the things that has really kind of crystallized this in Washington was the difference between what happened when it was proposed to use force in Syria last year and what happened this year. I was driving with my husband and son to New York City for Labor Day weekend, 2013, and we were listening to a baseball game on the radio. And I said to my son, I'm sorry, but we have to turn over to hear the president. I think he's going to announce that we're going to war in Syria. So get a lot of screaming from the back seat. I can barely hear anything, and I think I hear the president say that he's going to Congress. I made the mistake of also trying to drive during this part, and I almost drove the car off the Jersey Turnpike. Turn around, go back to Washington, and call some Hill staff, and the nonprofit I worked for had a briefing on a different issue scheduled for Tuesday morning, and the very senior congressional staff said, the White House is calling members who are all in their districts, but no one's briefing staff. Can you please put together a briefing of the staff on chemical weapons in Syria? And, I'm a smart person, and I know lots of smart people, but I was outside government, didn't have access to classified information, but yeah, sure, we can do that. So we go in on Tuesday morning, and we had about 100 House staff and then about 50 Senate staff, and the little tiny nonprofit I work for gave the first briefing on Syria, and you have never seen such a bunch of terrified-looking congressional staffers. And they did not know what they were supposed to think or what they were supposed to do. And then the phone calls started. And no one had organized it. No one could claim credit for it. The anti-war groups on the right and left were chasing the public rather than organizing the public. Something like 1% of the population, the entire 1 out of every 100 people who lives in Vermont, called their members of Congress to say, don't authorize use of force in Syria. And similarly large numbers, as I say, on both sides. You had Republican and Democratic members just saying, what is happening? And going from, well, yeah, the White House wants this, so we have to vote for it too. We can't possibly vote for this. And the shock that occasioned, that the American public would actually, and again, as I say, it was not organized, that the American public would just sort of say, no, we don't want this. The administration obviously hadn't counted on that. Republican and Democratic leadership hadn't counted on it either. Now, fast forward a year, You have those horrible videos. You have ISIS making rapid advances in Iraq. You have those appalling videos of the killings of American journalists. And you have the administration saying, okay, so we need to do something. And the response in Congress, the bipartisan response in Congress is, for God's sake, don't make us vote on it. Pretty much in those terms. I mean, you can look this up and read it. I'm really not being hyperbolic. The interesting thing is now you are going to have a vote on it. Now, why are you going to have a vote on it? Why does the White House suddenly want to have a vote on it now? They didn't want to have a vote on it 2 weeks ago. What changed in the last 2 weeks? Did something change on the ground in Iraq and Syria? No. So here you have this issue, which Congress, frankly, was very willing to try to dodge playing politics with. And again, as I say, this is a totally bipartisan criticism. And Congress's willingness to dodge and dodge and dodge then opened up for the White House the opportunity to say, okay, here guys, you said you wanted to debate this, now please debate it. So politics of that are going to be very interesting. Now, frankly, as I mentioned, a pretty decent majority of Americans supports military action in Iraq and Syria, so they're not going to have any trouble. Well, as far as the public goes, they're not going to have any trouble passing something. For reasons of congressional dysfunction, which, thank God, is not my topic, they are going to have extreme trouble finding something they can pass. And I don't know that it's going to be a very pleasant spectacle to watch, but in my view, I mean, it is what the Constitution tells us to do, so I'm personally glad that they're doing it. Russia. So the big developing news story today, Putin seems to have massed as many as 50,000 troops on the borders of Ukraine. There are Russian troops and equipment going back in. The Europeans' winter is coming, so no new sanctions probably. So what are, the U.S. is faced with a really unenviable set of policy choices because there's really nothing military that you can do. Our allies are really uninterested in doing anything that will push the Russians any harder than we're pushing them. And given the strength of Russian economic ties to Britain and France and Germany, U.S. sanctions, we can go on sanctioning and sanctioning, but the effect is going to be limited without our allies. And I don't care who the president was. Those countries, if your stock market is 50 or 60% dependent on Russia, or your shipping industry is dependent on building ships for Russia, you're going to make unpalatable political decisions, and there's no American president who, through force of personality, is going to change that. So, interesting thing is that the American public in the spring was very concerned about Russia. Very, very concerned about Russia. But with Russia getting pushed out of the headlines, first by ISIS, then by Ebola, the trend numbers of Americans who tell pollsters they're very concerned about Russia going down, 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 down. So, if you are an American policymaker who thinks that there should be a more robust military response, I just gave away what I think about that, but there are serious people who think differently, you're nonetheless confronting the challenge that it's really hard to keep the public's attention. So where do you want to focus your energy with the public? Do you want to focus your energy on explaining to them what you're trying to do in Iraq and Syria? And that, oh, by the way, that's going to take a darn long time under the best circumstances? Do you want to refocus them on Russia? How can it be that in this incredibly globalized and mediatized age, we can only focus on one thing at a time? How strange is that? Now, if those two things weren't enough, there's a little matter of Iran, which we've all, or those of us who aren't in government, have been able to forget about for a few months, but that's about to become the issue of the moment because the deadline for the nuclear talks is coming up in, 2 weeks. So enjoy your last couple of days free of all Iran all the time in the media. Now, here again, anybody who's still advising students, somebody could write a great dissertation or a master's thesis on sort of how you ask the questions about Iran determines the answers you get in American public opinion. It's just fabulous. There's basically two things that are very clear no matter how you ask the question. Americans do not want Iran to have nuclear weapons, and they do support using force to keep Iran from having a nuclear weapon. However, they prefer anything other than force to prevent Iran from having nuclear weapons. So you have both of those, and again, however you ask, that those two things are really clear. But that's not really a great guide for the policymaker. And here we are thankful that policymakers, at least in principle, are not supposed to be guided by polls. So when you try to poll on, is this solution good enough? Is that solution good enough? Does Iran, how many of its centrifuges does it have to give up? Now, you know, the public doesn't know how many of its centrifuges Iran should have to give up, and that's totally reasonable, frankly. If that's not what you do, then you shouldn't expect that any more than I should know how to choose when you have to have radical cancer surgery and when you can have much smaller scale cancer surgery. You wouldn't want me making that choice for you, frankly. So the way you ask the questions on that totally determines the answer. So when you see, oh, the public thinks this on Iran or the public thinks that on Iran. Now, but the thing that's going to be fascinating about that is either the administration will get a deal, which will then be fought out in Congress, whereupon various members of Congress' perceptions of how strongly the public feels about it, versus there used to be this quaint tradition that you gave a sitting president a certain amount of leeway on national security. And it will be very, very interesting to see whether opponents of a deal with Iran think they have a strong enough base in public opinion to overcome this tradition that you do sort of, a president has to be able to do foreign policy. On the other hand, if the president doesn't get a deal, if they decide that the Iranians won't give enough to make a good deal achievable, then we'll have this fascinating debate. What do we do next? And how do we talk about what we do next in a way that is firm and effective, but not needlessly fear-mongering? So for those with strong nerves, it's going to be a really interesting period on Iran. Last issue I'll just raise before going into Q&A is, and this one should take a few more months to burst into high gear, and it's the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Now, this is one where American public opinion is also just totally fascinating, because you have on the surface the kind of very clear, very steady support for Israel that we're all accustomed to over the decades. But if you dig into that a little bit, there is a massive generation gap. And younger Americans are much more likely to say, no, we shouldn't support Israel at the expense of the Palestinians. They're much more likely to have problems or concerns about how Israel chooses to defend itself. And this may be the most worrisome thing of all, they're much more likely to just shrug their shoulders and say, yeah, that's not our problem. A shocking number to me, I really had fun, as maybe you can tell, sort of looking back through all kinds of recent polling data for this. There's a majority of Americans who say it is not the U.S.'s responsibility to broker a peace deal between Israelis and Palestinians. And for those of us who spent time in the salt mines of American foreign policies in the 90s, that's just shocking. But it very much reflects both a younger generation and an older generation that's frankly fed up of the feeling that, rightly or wrongly, everything in the world is our responsibility. So we're going to go through a period where there's going to be quite a bit of pressure from Palestinians and their friends. There's going to be pressure on the U.S. You're going to have a lame duck president. You have this issue that in a way is not partisan, but again, both parties are split. You have Rand Paul saying he wants to end all aid to Israel and then trying to walk it back later. You have big splits inside the Democratic Party, plus these demographic splits. And so unlike how politics on that issue has played out for maybe the last 10 or 15 years, you're going to have a lot of people in Washington who aren't sure what they're supposed to do. And, on the one hand, that's going to be a very interesting, fruitful moment, and potentially a moment for actual learning and thinking, if I can be a little bit naive and optimistic for just a moment. On the other hand, it's a how can I put this diplomatically? A few well-organized, loud people with a bad idea can prevail. So maybe I'll just end by saying something nice about World Affairs Councils. Because I think, there is this perception that national security is completely outside politics. You go to the Hill and members will tell you, nobody ever calls me on these issues, nobody cares about these issues, I can, do whatever I want. Sure, the polls say the Americans want X, but nobody ever complains, so yeah, you and your advocacy groups and your sensible foreign policy, just go away. But I have found that folks like this, people who participate in these groups, you all are much more likely to be civic-minded. You are much more likely to know your elected officials. Your elected officials are much more likely to know you. You're very likely to be involved in public life through other ways. So in some ways, if you don't like the tone of discourse, if you don't like the idea that politics has as thoroughly infected our national security as everything else, you all, not us in Washington, but actually you all out in the country are probably the sort of the sharp edge of the spear in terms of doing anything about it. Because you are the people that your members of Congress listen to. And you're all rolling your eyes. You've just been through a campaign. You all had to see, an ad every 20 seconds for the Senate race and the governor's race. I apologize. But it is in fact, but I had the fascinating experience. Every time I come to Colorado, I have said something about Senator Udall. And I've invariably, the next time I saw someone from his office, said, I was talking to an audience of 50 people, 200 people in Colorado, and I said X about your senator. And people in the Q&A said, oh, I had no idea our senator did that. I said, So really, really very sincerely from someone inside the bubble, do not discount your potential to have an influence, because frankly, y'all are sort of it at this point, because people aren't listening to flag officers anymore. They aren't listening to experts, or experts all have got to go through partisan brokers in order to be taken seriously. So you are the repository. I don't want to scare you. I know it's a small group tonight, but you are the repository of how we bridge the gaps between where the public is on national security policy and where the really good policy choices are. So thank you all for doing that, and having the potential to keep your public service honest and smart and thoughtful. And now I am counting on Skye to moderate a really lively and vigorous discussion.
And you got a glass of water.
Woohoo!
Thank you. Wonderful. Thank you, Heather. And as you can tell, Heather hates her job. She hates the subject. She doesn't have any humor and is all a deadpan. Not at all. Not at all.
Hey,
all right.
I learned from a master.
Yeah, this is not a shy crowd. Yes, sir.
Yes. You, of all the different areas you mentioned, you did mention how special interest money affect policy and that type of thing. Can you address that?
Can you address the question of how special interest money affects policy beyond the comment that you made something about a bunch of people with bad ideas?
Well, I was so glad you asked that. There's actually been a really sort of fun little mini scandal in Washington recently when the New York Times ran this big article about foreign governments giving money to think tanks. Now, raise your hand if you're old enough to remember when there was a little scandal about foreign governments such as Japan and Taiwan giving money to think tanks in the 80s. Thank you. Thank you. I appreciate that a lot. I mentioned also this, where you were very used to the idea that the public doesn't respect the media anymore, public doesn't respect elected officials anymore, public doesn't respect clergy people anymore. My friends in think tanks were shocked that anybody would think they were less than totally integritous, nonpartisan, neutral, unbiased. And I said, guys, what century do you think you're living in? Get used to it. So yes, special interest money, so there's foreign government money, there's individual donor money, there's corporate money, there's foundation money, which I think in all fairness ought to be viewed as its own special interest. Yeah, everybody has to eat. So So there's, on the one hand, the question of, are fewer ideas coming into the policy process because of special interests? And I think there, the question is not, are fewer interests coming in, but do some ideas get a whole lot more attention and money dumped into them than others, and that is absolutely true. Second question is, do special interests influence what ideas are considered reasonable and possible? And there, I think, is where the biggest problem is. Because suppose you want to do agricultural reform in such a way that makes it easier for developing countries to export their agricultural products to the US and thus have industry and grow their own economies, and number one, need less foreign aid, and number two, have more things for the young men to do so they don't stand around on street corners and get radicalized and decide to go blow themselves up. But you have an agricultural lobby, and there, I'm not going to pick any, you could pick the sugar lobby, you could pick the ethanol lobby, you could, on and on and on, that are very able to outshout the people saying, they have a very simple one-step story. If you change the policy, it costs American jobs. Whereas my story about if you let sugarcane come in from Brazil, or if you let cotton come in from Pakistan, or if you let cocoa come in from West Africa, that's a much more complicated multi-layer story. And it's very hard to express in 140 characters on Twitter. It's very hard to express in the headline of an article, because I sometimes feel like nobody reads anything but headlines anymore. And it's very hard to express on those little bits of the local news that you hear in between the beeping of your microwave as you're cooking dinner at night, and the yelling at your kid to do his homework. So special interests are thus able to sort of maintain and police the status quo. So the world might have changed out here, but the special interest can keep policy from responding to that.
Adding on to that, last night, the World Wide Web came up, and the special interests that are telecommunications companies that are wanting to, on one side, President Obama's inflammatory, I'm being facetious, but it is picked up in the media as inflammatory. Here's where he stands on that. What do you do with that?
The internet, the debate of how free it's going to be, and the role of the telecommunications companies, and how's that going to shape what we know when we know it?
Well, this is where we get into the problem that one man's special interest is another man's guardian of constitutional liberties, right? Just like one man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter. So, we have an adversarial political system. The Founding Fathers, in their wisdom, gave us an adversarial political system. I think, in fairness, the Founding Fathers didn't anticipate all the tools we would have to be adversarial with. And also, the Founding Fathers didn't anticipate that all of us could participate equally in the process. And it does, if you limit the number of people who can participate in being adversaries, it is easier to reach consensual decisions. So I have to tell you, I don't know the answer to that. Because as I see media culture making it easier and easier and easier, frankly, all of us have many more platforms. The idea, again, thinking back to when Sky and I were working together, the idea that I go on TV is kind of amazing to me. But that there are all these TV channels, all these online channels, and not only that there's this insatiable maw of commentary, which means that people with more and more extreme views are getting to do more and more commentary. Number two, the thing I learned when I started to do TV is, again, I know this will shock you, but it's really first and foremost about entertainment. So if you've ever wondered how it is that the people who get chosen to go on TV and talk about issues are chosen, there's really three factors in play. One is that they appear to be knowledgeable and credentialed on the issue. Two is that they are entertaining and fun to watch. And three is that they are reliable and easy for the producer to get hold of. So, you know, that,
Got your name on it.
except for the entertaining part. But no, so that leads you to a very different kind of public debate. And then now, how many people get emails from a political party? Doesn't matter which one. How many people got so many emails? I only know the Democratic version of this, but how many people got asked to have lunch with Barack Obama so many times they thought about throwing their device across the room? I don't know what the Republican equivalent of that is, but I'm confident there is one. Now, there's a reason that happens, and it's not just because political fundraisers are sadistic and horrible human beings. Their theory, I'm told, is that, this is really good because I can blame the young people, but apparently the thought is with everything, the expectation now that your media world is so personalized, that you're expecting personalized, individualized content reaching out and poking you all the time, which is hugely different from those of us who grew up. You know, I spoke to a group of undergraduates at Penn last week, which I should say included folks from West Point and from the Naval Academy. So I'm really, really proud to have completely rounded out my service academy visiting in only a week, but I'm going to be really disappointed if you guys don't ask any questions. So in an environment where we can all construct our own private media universes and only hear what people that we've already decided agree with us are saying, and be in this echo chamber where, you know, if I'm outraged about the temperature of the water at the World Affairs Council, then I can go online and I can have 10 more people being outraged back, and so then suddenly it becomes a much worse outrage. I don't know how we're going to fix that. That's a long answer, a long and pessimistic answer to your question, but I really don't see how technology and all the wonderful things it does for us and all the ways we love to use it that are so ingenious and are so satisfying, but at the same time are sort of driving us further and further into our little shrieking cocoons. I really don't know how we're going to turn that around.
As a follow-up to that.
Yes, please.
Let me just say that I did get a personal invitation from Joni Ernst to castrate hogs.
You got a person, we need to catch this for the camera, I mean, right? You know, a personal invitation from Joni Ernst to go castrate hogs. That's, we just need to memorialize that.
But the social media, there are so many conspiracy theories, and we go back to, was there a Holocaust, and on and on and on. It's got to work young people's reality.
Simply a comment about, I'll just frame it another way. The fact that anything can be on the internet and assert itself to be equally credible and authentic, that it can really change the way people even have an ability to filter. And oh, by the way, I should add, just try and unsubscribe from any of those emails. It's not possible. But you're going to get your wish, Cadet David Chewy. David.
Ma'am, I just wanted to ask you two questions. The first question is, what are some things that are going right in politics right now? You know, just brighten up the mood a bit. And the second question is more of an answer that most of these conspiracy groups or on Facebook or Reddit or 4chan, most people don't treat them seriously. We call them trolls. So most people recognize that, you know, the moon is not made out of cheese or aliens.
It's not?
David answered his first question with his second question. What's going? The question was, what's going right in American politics? But part of that answer is that people are smart enough to know how to sift the wheat from the chaff on the internet and of all the stuff on the internet. And we'll hope that's uniformly true. Christy, right? Carol, is that right? Is that right? So, but what is going right, other than the fact I should point out that I don't remember lately that we're having fisticuffs on the floor of the House or the Senate. That was more common in the days of the Founding Fathers, so maybe there is some progress, but give me some more progress.
Well, and I want to say, I have to say, I have had a string of jobs where I have had the chance to be in charge of and mentor lots of wonderful 20-somethings. And I have to say, they have their feet on the ground at least as much as I did when I was a 20-something. It is not the case that that their young minds are more warped. You know, the only thing, one story, I'm running a nonprofit. Richard Hurlburt was on my board. He comes to visit the office one day, and I'm sort of taking him around, and we walk into a room, and there are 3 young men in their 20s, you know, feet up on the desk, having a bull session, and I sort of give them that get your feet off the desk look. And I say, we introduce Ambassador Hurlburt, and he says, oh, what are you all working on? And they say, we're writing a plan for Pakistan. And I'm thinking, oh, guys. And Hurlburt says, oh, really? That's interesting. When were you last there? And Hurlburt had a reputation as a screamer. And so I'm just waiting for, you know, my staff to be completely traumatized. But I'm thinking deservedly so. And at this point, they all kind of looked up and started to realize they were, you know, maybe in a little over their depth. And And Hurlburt says very calmly and politely, oh, well, I'm just back from there 2 weeks ago, and let me tell you, and launches into this wonderful magisterial monologue. And my 3 guys are just sort of looking, and I'm standing behind the ambassador going, guys, write this down. So, you know, a little hubris maybe, but, you know, what generation of 20-somethings was not complained about by their predecessors as having too much hubris, right? So now, having given myself a little extra thinking room about things that are going right, actually, starting overseas, for most of the world is more peaceful than it's ever been. More people are out of poverty than they've ever been. You know, you think about Latin America in particular. You know, in the early 90s, who would have dared predict that all those countries would manage to stay democracies? Central America is a fairly horrifying exception to this, but the progress that's been made in South America is really inspiring and amazing. Africa, mixed picture, but similarly lots of amazing things are happening. The speed at which people are moving out of poverty in China, again, China's long-term trajectory, fascinating, lots of open questions. But purely in terms of day-to-day misery, this is the best time to be alive in the history of humankind. And we do lose track of that. In our, you know, sort of narrowing back down to Washington, let me start with Joni Ernst, actually. Joni Ernst announced that one of the things she was looking forward to doing when she comes to Washington is working with Kirsten Gillibrand on the issue of sexual assault in the military. Now, for somebody who ran whose campaign was so polarizing and partisan, and a Democrat who's widely touted as a potential 2020 presidential candidate, that's going to be great to see the two of them working together. So there's another really interesting thing happening right now on prison reform, where you have libertarian Republicans who think there are too many crimes, liberal Democrats who are troubled by the racial bias inherent in sentencing, and religious figures on both sides who vaguely remember there being some famous religious figures who said some things about prisons. And you actually have the prospect of some really interesting things happening that change the way our prisons work for the better. So that's one sort of small example off the top of my head of if things don't get focused on. Actually, something else just off the top of my head, we know so much more about how to prevent domestic violence. And states, a couple of states, Massachusetts is one, Maryland is another, there may be some in this part of the country that I don't know about, that are, you know, instituting these amazing local police-based programs and really dramatically cutting fatal incidents of domestic violence. We haven't had a major terrorist attack here since 9/11. And there are a lot of terrorist groups that would love to hurt Americans, and film it in very upsetting and disgusting ways, that are doing horrible things to men and women and children in the Middle East and Africa. But there is no group that can mount an attack that can destroy our political, economic, social system. That we succeeded in turning back that threat before it built to that point. That doesn't mean there's not a threat, Doesn't mean there's not going to be plenty of work for you guys when you graduate, but we are not facing an existential threat from terrorism, in part because of things our country got right after 9/11, and because their ideology is so disgusting and hateful, and above all hateful to the people in the countries where it is, that it has self-limited. And it's hard to feel that way when you see on the news every day the appalling things that are happening, but it's self-limited. It's not World War II. It's not the possibility of nuclear annihilation. So that's some really, and hey, the economy's up. So that's some good news for you.
Okay, all right. Yes, sir?
Well, two comments on the question. One, I'm old enough to remember when AT&T was a monopoly. That reflects a lot about it. Most folks don't realize that your personal information is valuable. Every minute there's an auction on the internet selling your information to somebody else for money. So until you realize that your personal information has value. But what I'm more interested in is, what do your polling results tell you about research? Now, I'd like to trust the young gentleman here to tell me that they know when moon's not made out of cheese. However, a number of the other issues that seem to shift the pendulum back and forth, as you were mentioning, I watch these people. I mean, they're fearful about putting their kids on a playground because there's a predator going to take them.
Yeah.
And you try to convince folks that the chances of that happening are almost nil. But then, all of a sudden, there's this big to-do about Ebola, and nobody even sat down and looked at it to find out what it really meant and how you could transfer it and everything else. And I'm really concerned that the Googles and the rest of them, that when they do a Google research of Ebola, the people who pay the most in the search engine are the ones on the first page. And our people don't look at I was hoping that the polling would say, okay, what is your level and your depth of understanding of this issue, or is it just something that flashes across your face today? Because that really puts us in a hurt, because over time, as you swings back and forth, we're going to ignore everything. Does that make sense?
Yes.
I'm going to try and summarize that. I mean, you made a comment about headlines, and I think it's always been, even before the internet, it was still the case that people read headlines and didn't go below that. That's why they're called headlines. But the fact that there is no such thing as objective news, that what comes up first on your web search is going to be, somebody's paid to have it come up first. So what does polling data tell you about the level to which Americans understand the complexity of an issue, or do they simply react emotionally and leave the research to somebody else, but that research itself is going to be ideological and simplistic?
So no, Americans don't tend to understand the depth of issues, and this is not unique to national security. I mean, I know we always think in our field that we're incredibly special, or the internet age. But no, if you look at, sort of what do people understand about Ebola? What do people understand about Obamacare? What do people, clinical trials is the one that always kills me, that as many times as you explain to people that they're participating in a randomized clinical trial, people will say to you, yes, but my doctor will make sure I get the medicine. So, yeah, so that's the bad news. Now, the good news is, yes, sometimes people are just purely proceeding on emotion, but people actually try to proceed on hunches and strategies, the same as this. People is us, right? And all of us have some area of public policy in which we're embarrassingly ignorant, right? If you sort of think to yourself, what's the thing that I see it in the paper and I think, oh man, I'm actually reviewing a book right now, and I thought I was safe I'm reviewing 3 books that are written by retired generals. Well, who would have thought that one of them has a whole section on how to prevent the financial crisis from recurring and what kinds of investment regulations we should have? Well, guess what my area of shameful ignorance is? So there, I just confessed my area of shameful ignorance in front of 2 cameras. Whoops. So people do try to use hunches and strategies and do the best they can, and sometimes that's fairly effective. Now, the other thing that I want to say in response to your question is there's a guy who makes his living helping companies talk about risk, and that has the fabulous job title of risk communicator. And what he says is risk equals actual threat times outrage. And this is where the internet gives us a problem, because as we were saying earlier, it's so easy to hype up and fan outrage. So, for example, Ebola, almost no actual risk, right? But tons of outrage. So suddenly it's a huge problem. Whereas flu, 30,000 Americans die of flu every year. A real risk, but no outrage. Highway accidents, for heaven's sake, much more dangerous than terrorism, Ebola, you name it, but no outrage. Syria a year ago versus Syria now, what changed? Outrage because of those videos. So again, this is a dynamic that has always been present in the human mind. We've always been not perfectly rational creatures this way. But the good news is you can also use the internet to tamp down outrage and defang things that aren't true, but we're a lot better at using it to fan outrage than to tamp down outrage.
Christy.
My question for you is, you talked a lot on the fluctuation of public opinion and how it can be very, very short-term in the span. My question to you is that to what extent is that helpful, and to what extent is that destructive and not helpful at addressing the issues at hand?
The question is about public opinion and its short lifespan, its half-life. And to what extent is that destructive because people forget, or it's helpful because people forget?
Well, it sort of just is. So I guess that's the first thing. The other thing that's interesting is public opinion fluctuates most when people are confronted with a new issue or an unfamiliar situation. But eventually people do make up their minds. And once they make up their minds, they're actually fairly hard to convince. So the way that my friends who are pollsters talk about it is the fluctuation is an opportunity. That while public opinion is fluctuating, you still have time to convince. I was involved a couple of years ago in a project looking at Americans' views of American Muslims and the American Muslim community sort of trying to think about this. And the first round of opinion surveys we got back were, frankly, revealed a lot of pretty negative, even racist and sometimes kind of untrue. Like the number of things that said, they don't speak good English, where, somebody educated in a good school in Pakistan or India probably speaks better English than me. But I looked at these numbers and I thought, oh, this is horrible. And the public opinion guy said, no, these numbers are great. There's lots of opportunity here. So exactly what, and I said, first of all, I'm glad I don't do what you do. And second, tell me why there's opportunity here. And they said, because the public says we don't know and we want to know more. And where you have fluctuation combined with interest, that's your opportunity. When the public says, yeah, I know all I need to know about that, then you've lost your moment. So from the policymaker point of view, the trick is, and it's much easier said than done, is number one, seeing where people actually want to know more, and then of all the things you as a policymaker can spend your time on, and of all the things you can spend your public attention on, because you don't want to see your same, as we were just saying about campaigns, you don't want to see the president on your TV every day. You start to tune out after a while. Even the president of the United States' bully pulpit has some limits. So you have to choose which issues are the ones you're going to be out there talking about over and over and over. And there's always an intense competition. And in the national security realm, the problem we have is a lot of times our issues are clearly very important, but they're not urgent. There's not that domestic outrage. So then we don't talk about them. So then the public hardens its opinions in ways that are maybe not as fact and data informed as we wish they were. So that's one way of answering.
Then Karen.
Well, Christy's going to stand up, I'm going to stand up. It's interesting to me, this Ebola business, you said minimum risk, maximum outrage, and then the third part of that stool seems to me is the amount of effort the administration and other places like that is spending on something that probably doesn't really fall right up there with the rest of the things that you have mentioned. You open with, here's the question, you open with analysis of exit polls. That's okay, but how do you factor in the 2/3 of the voters that didn't vote?
exit polls reflect those who voted. How do you factor in the 2/3 that didn't vote?
You look at other polls that talk to registered voters rather than actual voters, and this is maybe a moment to say something about polls. So any one individual poll is almost worthless, right? Because there are so many. Methodologically, some are better than others. How you ask the questions matters so much. So when you're analyzing, anyone who gets up in front of you and says, I have a poll that says, you should be kind of suspicious. What you really want to look at is trends over time. So if people are becoming more and more and more willing to put boots on the ground in Iraq, for example, or if people are becoming less and less and less confident that the government is doing enough on Ebola, or by contrast, if the public is becoming more and more and more confident, if multiple polls say that over time, then you've actually got something that's worth looking at. The other point I would make is that the folks who vote every time, and we know what demographics those are, there's been like nothing but coverage of that in the media recently, it is the case that folks who don't vote as often maybe get paid less attention to. And so there is an interesting sort of circular dynamic there, and then you can talk about how that happens, and do people vote less often because they feel that they're not paid attention to, thus creating a self-fulfilling prophecy? If they voted more, would then there be more attention paid to them? But there's no question, there's a reason that exit polls are treated like gold on issues, because the perception is the people who will bother to haul themselves out and vote in an off year, they're the squeaky wheels. Right? I should say we're the squeaky wheels since I voted. But yes, and this is another sort of interesting thing about polls and national security, that there's this wonderful deliberative polling tradition where you take a group of people like this and you spend an hour and you ask questions and you ask detailed questions and then you introduce information and you ask the questions again. And you can get extraordinarily sophisticated and thoughtful and nuanced policy responses out of a group of folks picked out of the phone book in that kind of environment. But guess what? Voting's not like that. Day-to-day life isn't like that. So part of the trouble is with polling, you can create an environment in which people are wonderfully sophisticated and make wonderfully thoughtful choices. And for all the reasons we were discussing earlier with respect to the media, our day-to-day political life isn't like that.
Well, I had a comment, first of all, on your question, and that was that, isn't it true that where you have internet searches or social media, people tend to only see the results based on their own history or based on what their contexts
Yep.
are. So in a way, it's not any different from print media in that you're kind of self-selecting your own, you're reading what you already believe and what your peer group already believes anyway. So there isn't really a huge leap to me. But my question is, I was reading, I think it was in the Atlantic, there was an article that we, like the Congress and we as a society, no longer, we used to support our president's policies, whether we support the president or not.
Yep.
And so how can we forge any kind of effective national security policy, whether it's our president that is sitting now or whoever's elected in 2016, if we don't have kind of that cohesive body of support behind it?
I'm going to try and capture your comment as well, that to some extent, which I think is interesting. To some extent, even what you read on the internet is self-selected, in that much of what is coming up as a result of search is because, oh, that's Karen Burkhardt. She reads these things. She looked at those things last time. I remember that. So we'll feed her again what we know she liked. So it's a bit of a self-selection, just as we pick up the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal, depending upon pre-elections or whatever it is. So I think it's an interesting comment. Now I've totally lost the question.
It's about how to forge an effective.
Right, and you know, a tradition. I'm reading David Halberstam's The 50s. Certainly goes back to then. You know, the days of Walter Cronkite and so on. The tradition of support for traditional figures, support of the president's policies, even if I don't like the president. There's a certain deference or, you know, a willingness to defer to, well, they must know something I don't. but that seems totally out the window, if I've summarized your question right. Are we just going to keep going in that direction? Can you reverse that? Or that is what it is?
Yeah, well, I'll defer a little bit. Have we got any historians in the crowd? Well, you know,
A lot of gray hair.
what's interesting is this period that we're all so profoundly shaped by, the post-World War II period, it is not the norm in American politics. And that while we all grew up in a period where there was that kind of bipartisan comedy and politics end at the water's edge and all those other wonderful cliches, you know, think about how virulent the opposition to Roosevelt was in the 30s. You know, think about the fisticuffs and worse than fisticuffs on the floor of the House. Think about the degree of opposition to the Louisiana Purchase, you know, which in retrospect looks like this amazing, wonderful thing that obviously everyone must have gotten behind. Well, no. I mean, think about pre-Civil War, what that period in American history and American politics were like. You know, in fact, we have lived through before highly polarized and highly uncivil, including with a press that was at least as bad as what we have now, by the way. So I don't know how we're going to fix it. I don't know how. I think a big problem right now is that we don't know, our generation, the boomers and the Xers, we don't know how to be effective in this environment. I mean, to me, we're not going back. If you, I co-authored an article, which was really fun because I co-authored it with, I knew the policy advocacy side and my co-author knew the political science, but looking at the factors that have created this polarization. And in fact, the American political parties of the 50s and 60s were an anomaly in the history of democracy. That you had people that were not sorted by ideology, that there were lots of reasons you were a Republican or a Democrat, but they didn't tend to be very strongly ideological. Obviously, those days are now gone, but that makes us much more like political parties in every other industrialized democracy on earth. And somehow they all manage. So the interesting question, you know, we're not going back anytime soon to the way those of us who are old enough remember it being, but so the challenge for us is figuring out how to be effective in this climate we're in now. And an interesting question, you know, for you all as citizens, for us as citizens, is how can we tell our leaders, you know, we want you to be partisan, because clearly we do, or we wouldn't vote for them, but we also want you to be effective.
I was just wondering, so you talked a lot about how different people in the polls were concerned about different issues, and going back to national security, in reality, what is probably the most prominent issue that could cripple our national security that maybe we don't look at or we don't notice because we're more interested in, oh, well, I'm worried about ISIS or I'm worried about Ebola. What in reality is our biggest national security issue, and how do we get the public to become aware?
You talked about no real existential threat. Is there one, or is there one under the surface that we should be paying attention to? What is the real national security issue in your view that may or may not be on anybody's radar that we should be paying attention to?
Well, that is a fantastic question, and I almost feel like we should sort of go around the room on that because
Take a poll.
So I will name off two that are the two that I think come closest to being existential. And when I name them off, that's going to be sort of the answer to the second part of your question, because they're both big and diffuse and thus very hard to explain to people. So one of them, to me, is climate change, both because of what it has the potential to do to our own country and our own way of life, but also what desertification and drying up of. So think about Pakistan and Afghanistan if the rivers dry up, and resource conflict. Think about China with its rates of population growth if there's suddenly not enough water. Think about how much worse Central America could get and how much more migration there could be. Think about deserts. Think about the growth of the Sahara. and how many more migrants that pushes into Europe, how many more rootless young men that pushes into the arms of extremist groups. So climate disruption, I'll call it, is one. And then the other, which is not original to me, as I mentioned, I've been reviewing a bunch of books by retired 4-stars, and I'm very sorry about this because I know it's an Air Force town, but Admiral Stavridis calls it convergence. And this is where you look at not just terrorists, not just Al-Qaeda or ISIS, but all the forces of disintegration and extremism that are able to use these wonderful networks and communications tools that we have. So, this kind of convergence of terrorists and criminals and cyber war, and that frankly we as a society are not even able to have conversations about. So those are my two contenders for the really big threats that we need as a society to figure out how to address. I do feel like taking a little bit of it. Does anyone else want to throw in something else? You got two.
Anarchy versus statehood.
Anarchy versus statehood. And
Russ.
Say personal freedom
personal freedom
against national security.
against national, that, I'm gonna quickly say something about that because it's something I've been working on a lot, and then I promise to let you all go.
One more question.
Okay, great. But so we're in this fascinating moment where, on the one hand, we have no immediate existential threat. On the other hand, we have all these things that we're worried about that are very tangible. Videos of people's heads getting cut off are very tangible. Our friends and neighbors and family members who were killed or wounded serving in Iraq or Afghanistan, very tangible. And then this notion of personal freedom, which is less tangible. Then you add on top of that, what is the meaning of personal freedom when Google and AT&T know everything there is to know about me already anyway and are busily out there selling it? The NSA could never in a million years know as much about me and assemble it as neatly as my internet provider does. So this actually fits exactly into the question you raised, which is, I don't like framing it as a trade-off. We have a set of national security challenges, and then we have a set of personal freedom challenges, which are also affected by all this information flows, technology, big data. We love all the things that big data gives us. And then there's the price we pay, which is kind of little and diffuse, and maybe we don't see it until one day we see it horribly. So trying to have the conversation, I have recently been running a project that was trying to develop a conversation about how do you do counterterrorism policy in a way that's friendly to human rights. But it turns out, if you are so scared about the idea that ISIS is going to come to Colorado Springs, Colorado, and cut off your head, it is very hard to talk about how you should maybe be a little more concerned about internet privacy. And then, if your elected member of Congress thinks, no one is going to turn me out of office for something that AT&T does with the internet, but God forbid there should be a terrorist attack in Colorado Springs, I'm sure as heck going to get turned out of office for that if I voted the wrong way on some surveillance bill. So we're in this, you can have a whole range of opinions on what the right boundaries are and how much surveillance is too much and what kinds of counterterrorism policies are useful and what ones are frankly counterproductive. But we can't even have that conversation for the reason of this gap where the public actually is quite capable of having fairly sophisticated and thoughtful and nuanced views about it, but we never have the environment in which we can have that. And instead, we have you don't want to be blamed when the next attack happens. So nobody, and frankly, you just lost a senator here who, for whatever other strengths and weaknesses he had, was an enormous champion of civil liberties and privacy and was one of the real brave voices on that in Washington. See, I said I always say something nice about Senator Udall every event I go to. And, I don't think that had anything to do with why he won or lost, but who's going to have that conversation now? even assuming, the job of our legislators in Washington is to have strong voices on both sides and make a balance that comes out together. He took those positions, he lost. Who's going to take those positions now?
Russ, you get to come back.
Well, but it's somewhat difficult to know where to strike the balance when you don't know what the bounds are. And there's a tremendous, maybe not tremendous, but there's enough distrust in government when you have the director of the NSA lying to Congress. You have a senator speaking for, I think, 18 hours in order to get the president to give some thought on whether we would deploy drone strikes in the United States. And when I walk into an airport, I don't know what my civil liberties are anymore.
Right.
So it's hard to, I guess what I'm getting is, why hasn't there ever been a national security debate, a public debate on national security?
The question, after a lot of frustration about current realities, which I think many of us share, is why isn't there a debate? And I think there was a hand over here that wanted to get a last question in. Yes, well, you get to tag on to this last question. Yes, so you get to ask your question, and then we'll let Heather.
And then I have to answer both of them, so.
So we're gonna get your question at the moment as well.
Mine is not nearly that profound.
That's okay.
That's okay.
I do feel that in the nature of polling, when you hear one poll outcome, you could almost always find another one to balance it out or contradict it, and there's room for conversation. It seems that almost every week we hear the president's approval rate, and that is the one poll, I'm gonna call it that loosely, that no one ever argues with. I've never heard anybody counter it or say, no, that's wrong, it's too low, or whatever. I actually don't know where those numbers come from. I don't know who is approving or disapproving. I guess I would just sort of like your opinion on that. And do you feel it's valid and accurate?
We'll start with this one, and then I'll reframe Russ's question. So where do approval ratings come from? Where's that poll, and is that valid? That we always get this running poll as to the president's approval rating. And then the broader question, which is a good way to end this, is why isn't there a debate about national security versus civil liberties, we'll put it that way, that has a debate in the abstract as well as in the specific policy questions? Or is that not possible to have that kind of debate?
So there is a specific poll, and after this ends, I can actually pull it up on my phone and show you. And the reason it's valuable and that people refer to it is that it's the same question asked of a randomized group of Americans every month. So like I was saying earlier, it has the value that you can track it over time. What I think is the biggest criticism of it, and the question of whether it has any validity, is that over the longer scope of time, Americans don't approve of much of anything anymore. So comparing, say, President Bush or President Obama's ratings to President Eisenhower or President Truman's ratings, it's a totally different world. So I think that, I think it has some validity as a short-term snapshot of how cranky the American people are feeling on any given day. But long-term, because the world and our whole notion of approving and not approving is so different, look, it's like, where can I put this? It's a little more useful than horoscopes. But it's the same kind of fun value, I guess I would say. And for the bigger question about why, as someone who spent a significant chunk of the last few years of my life trying to get Americans to have a debate on how to conduct national security policy, keeping civil liberties in mind, I've written extensively about it, spoken on the Council on Foreign Relations about it. So there actually has been a kind of ongoing, very intense but low-level debate. And I think the answer to your question is really something about how fragmented and how having a huge fragmented media landscape also means that you can kind of diminish any particular debate. So, for example, there were multiple House and Senate committee hearings on the aspects of the Snowden revelations that concerned privacy. There were extensive drone hearings. 2 years ago now? There were, extensive and repeated hearings about surveillance of different kinds. And if the comparison I like to make is to the early 70s in the Church Committee, where you had concerns about excesses in the intelligence community and failures of intelligence, and you had very intensive long-term investigations in both the House and the Senate that were avidly covered in the media and that ultimately led to legislation. Whereas now you have endless revelations in the media that kind of have their burst and then go away, and then you have the next little burst and they go away, and they haven't. What's been interesting to me is you have a lot of concerns about oversight of our intelligence apparatus, of how our privacy is being protected, of whether various intelligence techniques that are being used and targeted killing techniques, drones in particular, whether, number one, whether they're legal, and number two, whether they're actually effective. And you're gonna have to cut me off soon because I could talk about this all night and it's a whole separate topic. But the fact of the matter is there have been these really interesting little micro debates, and then they just go away and they never come together into anything big enough to actually result in a discussion that would force the previous administration, this administration, or the next administration to change policy. And so in a way, we have a national debate that mirrors the national media we have. It's vibrant, it's lively, it's very broad, but it's also diffuse and really small. And if you're just a person trying to go through your life, you could completely miss it. So thank you all for being people who don't miss those debates and for coming out on this horrible night and being so patient and asking great questions.
That's why we have World Affairs Councils.